Coming up on Focus Black Oklahoma. We dive into the complications, contention, and chemicals of capital punishment in Oklahoma. We investigate healthcare as reparations in the Black community. We uncover the unseen and unrecognized contributions of Black World War II veterans. We explore overcoming the challenges of keeping Native languages alive. And we take a closer look into the overwhelming amount of anti-protest bills that recently became law in Oklahoma. All this and more ahead on Focus Black Oklahoma.
Focus Black Oklahoma is sponsored by the Black Church Traditions and African American Faith Life program at Phillips Seminary, offering a master's degree in social justice online and in person. Learn more at wherefaithleads.com.
This is Focus Black Oklahoma. I'm Kuma Roberts.
And I'm Colby Webster.
For our first story, contributor Carlos Moreno dives into the chemicals and complications of Oklahoma's capital punishment system. Here he is with the details.
When a veterinarian euthanizes a dog or cat, the chemical most widely administered is called pentobarbital. A common phrase one would say is that they are putting the animal to sleep. An appropriate description, as pentobarbital is a sedative, an anticonvulsant, and in high enough doses causes death by inducing coma and stopping the heart and lungs. Lundbeck, a company in Denmark that manufactures pentobarbital, stopped selling it to U.S. states that imposed the death penalty in 2012. Other European manufacturers of pentobarbital and sodium thiopental followed suit, prohibiting the use of their products for executions in the United States, leaving states to obtain these drugs illegally and from questionable sources. Associated Press reporter Katie Fretland began investigating the source of Oklahoma's execution drugs in 2012 and found that the Oklahoma Department of Corrections was using a petty cash fund totaling more than $50,000 to purchase pentobarbital. Fretland published her findings in the Colorado Independent in 2014, describing emails which contained, quote, banter about exchanging lethal injection help for football tickets and other favors, unquote, from the department's colleagues in Texas. In January 2014, Oklahoma used a combination of pentobarbital, potassium chloride, and vecuronium bromide to execute convicted murderer Michael Lee Wilson. The use of vecuronium bromide is banned by the Animal Welfare Act in the euthanasia of animals. As the drugs were administered, Wilson was reported to have said, quote, "I feel my whole body burning," unquote, before he died. After Oklahoma was unable to obtain pentobarbital, General Counsel for the Oklahoma Department of Corrections, Mike Oakley, was given the task of finding alternative drugs for executions. Oakley had no medical training. The drug Oakley selected was midazolam. He retired 6 days before the April 2014 execution of Clayton Lockett. On April 21st of 2014, the Oklahoma Supreme Court granted a stay of execution that was reversed by Governor Mary Fallin, who scheduled Lockett's execution for April 29th. On that evening, the midazolam Lockett was injected with failed to work quickly, and he was then injected with vecuronium bromide. Though the execution was stopped after several botched procedures by the medical team using this untested and unusual combination of lethal drugs, Lockett died 43 minutes after being sedated. Another botched execution occurred when Oklahoma mistakenly used potassium acetate, a chemical manufactured to de-ice airplane wings, intending to use potassium chloride in the execution of Charles Warner in January of 2015. Warner was heard saying, quote, "It feels like acid," unquote, and, quote, "My body is on fire," unquote, during the execution. Governor Fallin was forced to halt the execution of Richard Glossop after the state made the same mistake in the fall of the same year. Though neither the combination of drugs nor the procedures for these botched executions have changed since 2015, Oklahoma carried out the execution of John Marion Grant on October 28th. Sean Murphy, reporter for the Associated Press, witnessed Grant's execution and described that Grant convulsed about 24 times and vomited after midazolam was administered. Murphy compared the execution to that of Clayton Lockett. Writing for The Atlantic magazine, journalist Elizabeth Brunig explained that in order to administer midazolam, it first must be dissolved in hydrochloric acid. These executions are continuing even while U.S. District Judge Stephen Freout agreed to hear the case of 26 Oklahoma death row inmates, calling Oklahoma's current 3-drug protocol, midazolam, bacterionium bromide, and potassium chloride, unconstitutional, violating the Eighth Amendment clause prohibiting cruel and unusual punishment. That case is scheduled to be heard in late February of 2022. I visited with Dawn Heath, minister at Edmond Trinity Christian Church. Heath is also an attorney and chairs the Oklahoma Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. The coalition consists of member organizations, mainly in the Oklahoma City area, such as the American Civil Liberties Union of Oklahoma, Amnesty International OKC, and Catholic Charities. He explained that the length of imprisonment and the conditions inside of prisons are torture in and of themselves. We also spoke about the conditions of Julius Jones' incarceration for over 20 years.
All the other Western democracies in Europe, the maximum sentence is 20 to 25 years for any crime. There's a group in America called the Sentencing Project, which is committed to that. We now have more people serving life sentences and life without parole than we had in prison when the war on drugs started in 1970. Life in prison. And the mass incarceration problem is because we have an aging prison population. We now incarcerate more 50 and 60-year-old people than we ever have. Are they threats to society? I mean, a 19-year-old man is a whole lot more aggressive and violent than a 55-year-old man. Bigler Stouffer, he's the next person after Julius Jones. He's 79. He's been incarcerated since 1985. Do we really want the state executing a 79-year-old man on our behalf? He served 35 years. Isn't that enough? Julius has served 22 years. He was incarcerated when he was 19. There's no other country in the Western Hemisphere that's had an execution in the last 10 years. Just the United States. We have dictators that kill people, but we don't have any countries that it's part of their legal system to execute people. And Oklahoma has the highest execution rate of any state in the country. Julius gets to take 3 showers a week, and he's handcuffed and shackled to go to the shower.
John Grant and Julius Jones were both granted stays of execution on October 20th by the 10th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in Denver. However, Oklahoma Attorney General John O'Connor immediately asked for the stays to be vacated. In a 5-3 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court sided with O'Connor and allowed the executions to continue. 4 days later, Oklahoma's Pardon and Parole Board recommended that Governor Kevin Stitt grant clemency for Julius Jones. Bishop Melvin Fitzgerald Cooper, senior pastor of World One for Christ Family Life Ministries, believes that more faith leaders in Oklahoma need to make their voices heard when it comes to issues of criminal justice. I spoke with him at Greenwood Cultural Center during a community event calling for Governor Kevin Stitt to follow the Pardon and Parole Board's recommendation.
So we felt that the religious community needs to come together. Pastors need to come together. We can no longer be silent. We have to let our voices be heard, and so we wanted to come together and speak to our governor. We want our governor, who is a man of faith, just like we are, to listen to our voices and to make the right decision. We want him to honor the Pardon and Parole Board, who have made these recommendations a number of times. And so we're asking that he will listen to them and do the right thing. Since he's a man of faith, we're people of faith, we believe that if he will just be guided by the Spirit of God, we believe that he will make the right decision on behalf of Julius Jones.
On November 5th, the pastors of 10 black churches, including Paradise Baptist, Antioch Baptist, and Morning Star Baptist churches in Tulsa, jointly sent a letter supporting the Pardon and Parole Board's recommendation to grant clemency for Mr. Jones. Oklahoma's mishandling of death penalty cases has brought the debate about its constitutionality to the national spotlight. It is currently authorized in 27 states. In recent years, 9 states, most recently Washington, Delaware, and Colorado ruled their state's capital punishment laws unconstitutional. In 2016, Oklahoma voters approved State Question 776, making the death penalty part of Oklahoma's constitution. Polls conducted in 2015 and again in 2021 show that only 24% of the state's voters oppose the death penalty. But State Senator Connie Johnson believes that the national attention on the case of Julius Jones might mark a turning point in attitudes.
I view this as an opportunity to educate. And I hope we can have even more conversations on all of the criminal justice reform issues facing our state. Because we also know that Black people are just going to prison, not necessarily death row, but they're going to prison disproportionately to our occurrence in the population for certain crimes more than others. It's all about the vote. I had a brother that was killed in 1981. The guy who killed my brother was not convicted of the death penalty. I didn't want the death penalty for him. The street came to me and said, "You want us to take him down, Connie?" And I couldn't say yes because it wasn't gonna bring my brother back.
For Focus Black Oklahoma, I'm Carlos Moreno in Edmond.
As calls mount for reparations for the survivors and descendants of the Tulsa Race Massacre, doctors nationwide are calling for a different form of repair, one that will address this country's profound health inequities. Nick Alexandrov has more.
There has not been a single year since the founding of the United States when Black people in this country have not been sicker and died younger than white people. That's how a pair of doctors, Mary T. Bassett and Sandro Galea, began their article in the New England Journal of Medicine last year. The piece called for reparations as a public health priority, as a way to end Black-white health disparities. Those inequalities, a core feature of U.S. life, have been in the news since COVID hit. PBS was one station covering the story.
COVID-19 is forcing all of us to live in new ways. But as Amna Nawaz reports, it is also exposing long-standing rifts in American society.
Officials have said over and over again, the virus doesn't discriminate. But the disparities that have long been part of our medical system in America are now leading to what some call a crisis within a crisis. Black and brown communities across the country being hit harder, in greater numbers, and with fewer resources to save them.
North Tulsa, where a third of the residents are Black, is one of these resource-starved communities. Wendy Williams knows that part of the city well. She's been a healthcare worker for decades.
I've lived in Tulsa since 1989. I moved to Tulsa from Chicago. One of my first jobs upon arriving to Oklahoma, Tulsa, I worked for the Tulsa City County Health Department in the maternal child department. And then from there, I worked at Doctor's Hospital, which is no longer in existence. I've also done school nursing. Most of my career has been teaching. I taught with Tulsa Tech for years. I've taught all allied health career classes, and then my main focus was teaching licensed practical nurses. I've taught at Langston on the RN level. So, and now I'm teaching again entry-level healthcare positions as a business owner. And so I own my own training center now where I train individuals interested in nursing and nursing careers, certified nurse aides, certified medication aides.
I visited Wendy at her Health and Safety Education Consultants Training Center in mid-November. She took a break from instructing a student to speak with me. In our conversation, the word lack came up again and again.
So lack of health care, in North Tulsa. So North Tulsa still suffers for adequate access for its residents as far as health care is concerned. If your doctor doesn't reside in your community, for the most part, you don't really expect them to have a vested interest in your community or even you as an individual.
You can see what she's talking about just by driving through that part of the city. This isn't South Tulsa, where St. Francis Hospital sprawls at 61st and Yale, or Utica Square, where St. John Hospital towers across the street from Saks Fifth Avenue, Banana Republic, and other upmarket shops. Or use Google Maps to find an urgent care facility. You'll see them fanning out to the southeast of downtown, but not in North Tulsa. Then you have the invisible impacts, the effects this medical infrastructure, or lack of it, has on the inner worlds of North Tulsa residents.
So if I have to travel across town to see a physician, whether they look like me or not look like me, but just the idea that you can't relate to where I'm coming from, what I have access to, and so how would you even know to ask me questions about why I'm not taking my medication, or what's the issue with not eating right, because you don't have an idea of where I come from. And you feel that when you go into certain areas in Tulsa. I don't really belong here, but this is where I have to go. This is where my insurance is saying that I can go, and so this is all I have. And then you kind of shy away. You may not advocate for yourself because you feel like you can't say anything, or it will risk whatever the care outcome is going to be. So there's a lot of issues, or a lot of variables that play into that.
Wendy explains that our healthcare system, while offering some benefits, also compounds these degrading experiences.
I can just guesstimate or make a guess that most North Tulsa residents rely on Medicaid, because Medicaid is specifically for lower income and people with certain disabilities. So if I am a Medicaid Sooner Care recipient, then I only have certain doctors who actually are on the roll for those for that particular plan. So that's what I'm stuck with. And then we don't even know, some providers won't take Medicaid patients, and so providers who are forced to or have to for whatever reason, their outlook on the patient who is a Medicaid recipient is already preconceived. Or this is somebody who doesn't work, or this is somebody who doesn't have, or so now I have to deal with this. And so that sends a barrier, and it affects the visit, the type of care that person will receive. And I'm not saying that our providers do that, but it's kind of like a preconceived notion that you're on Medicaid, you don't have, and so you're not going to be a compliant patient.
Things weren't always this way. In 1920, the historically black Greenwood district had at least 17 doctors and physicians. Then the race massacre happened. In the assault, marauding whites targeted Dr. A.C. Jackson, the nationally renowned surgeon. They shot him dead in the street. The killer might have been James Cowboy Long, a man later charged with massacre-related arson. James M. Key, another Greenwood doctor, survived, but he lost everything. In his lawsuit against city officials, he wrote that the police had bombed his neighborhood from an airplane, razing his property in the process. Tulsa's black residents rebuilt Greenwood after the massacre, and there were, the Wall Street Journal reported recently, a number of thriving black doctors' practices serving the community in the 1940s and 1950s. But then came another wave of destruction. Following a 1957 Tulsa Highway Plan and federal-level highway acts in 1965 and 1968, a freeway system was charted through the neighborhood. As Tulsa photographer Don Thompson lamented, it took the heart out of Greenwood. And a couple of years ago, the city of Tulsa acknowledged that historical actions including redlining and exclusionary zoning have led to disinvestment in neighborhoods that were once thriving in Tulsa. Today, Greenwood, along with the rest of North Tulsa, needs more than just better health care.
Hello, welcome to Oasis! Yeah. Man, I'm grateful this morning as I was getting dressed after the gym. I was moved with so much compassion. Because so many people have fought. So many people have cried out. So many people have desired for this moment to take place. And I'm so honored and I'm so grateful to be able to serve not just this community, but to serve north, east, south, west. I believe that, man, this is a mark of a dawning of a new day.
A.J. Johnson, owner of the Oasis Fresh Market, spoke at the store's grand opening in North Tulsa last May. The supermarket begins to address the region's food desert status, but it's only a start. Wendy explains.
The lack of adequate food supply. North Tulsa has always been a food desert, and now we have the Oasis, but still that's only one grocery store. And then if you go further north to Turley, you do have Warehouse Market. But again, access to fresh fruits and vegetables, good meat, just those things are kind of like baseline needs to build on to have good health. So not just going to the doctor, but some of those other things that contribute to a healthy lifestyle. We're still lacking, to be in comparison to other communities.
Food scarcity plagues not just North Tulsa, but communities of color nationwide. It's a system food justice leaders call food apartheid. And the solution to this and other health-related disparities, many advocates believe, is the same now demanded as a form of justice for race massacre survivors and descendants. Nancy Chen covered this story for CBS last May.
100 years later, some Black leaders in Tulsa are demanding reparations over what happened in the Greenwood district.
And Tiffany Cross followed up this past September for MSNBC.
Joining me now is Demario Solomon Simmons, attorney for Tulsa survivors and descendants, and he's been pursuing justice for this case for a long time. So, Demario, so happy to have you here. Now, you're going into court now this month on September 28th. Tell us what's at stake in this court hearing.
What's at stake is the first time ever in 100 years to try to get actual justice. For 100 years, the perpetrators of the massacre, the city, the chamber, and others have acted with impunity for this massacre, this attempted genocide of Black people in Tulsa. And they've been protected by the Oklahoma court system this entire time. No case has been able to move forward. And on September 28th, we have our very first ever in 100 years hearing on this issue.
Much as Solomon Simmons demands the race massacre's victims be compensated for their suffering, many physicians, particularly since George Floyd's murder last year, are calling for reparations as a public health measure. There's the demand issued in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the world's premier medical journals, that I quoted at the start of this segment, for example. And in Frontiers in Public Health, another 4 physicians made the case for health reparations last July. They argued that physicians and scientists were the architects of the racial taxonomy upon which this country was founded. In the mid-1800s, for example, Dr. Josiah Nott argued that Black people were a different species and thus fit for enslavement. This foundational thinking echoes today. In 2016, a survey of 222 white medical students and residents produced unsettling results. Half of the doctors in training endorsed myths about biological differences between Blacks and whites, and many of these doctors in training assumed Blacks feel less pain than whites. Assumptions like these can cost lives. There's the national Black-white infant mortality gap, with Black newborns more than twice as likely to die in their first year as white newborns, or this country's Black-white life expectancy gap, which, thanks to COVID, grew by nearly a year and a half in 2020, from 3.6 to 5 years. Scaled down to Tulsa, that gap is as large as 13 years between the resource-starved North and the wealthy, majority-white South. These gaps, the Frontiers in Public Health authors argue, require both reparations and the kind of community-focused care Wendy Williams wants to see more of in Tulsa. There's a precedent for this kind of care, implemented by a group that, in much political commentary today, is derided as a band of violent, anti-police terrorists, the Black Panthers. But in 1978, that organization got attention for a different reason. Here's a pre-Reading Rainbow LeVar Burton with the story.
Many people know of the Panthers because of their run-ins with the police, but there's another side to this organization. In Oakland, in many ways a poor community, the Panthers are also known for their projects like the breakfast program for school children and for the Community Learning Center. When we visited the center, we saw that they had a different approach to teaching and learning. We're going to be meeting a student at the Learning Center, a young lady named Kalita, and when the film opens, Kalita is interviewing Huey Newton, founder of the Black Panthers.
Look who's here, My name is Kalita Smith. I'm 8.5 years old. I live in Oakland, California. I go to school at the Oakland Community Learning Center. My school was started by the Black Panther Party. We don't have grades in our school. We have levels. They put us in different levels based on what we can do.
Everything was a problem. For example, they used to serve cookies and I think graham crackers and milk in the morning to children in primary school who had the money to pay for it. And if you didn't have the money to pay for it, you had to put your head on the desk until the other kids finished eating. I always thought that was very bad, but at the Oakland Community School, everybody eats.
The school that shaped Kalita Smith during her formative years, and yes, that's the same Kalita Smith from The Bernie Mac Show, Z Nation, and other television programs, could serve as a model for health-oriented institutions in Tulsa and beyond. These institutions could channel the optimism that, for Wendy Williams, is a defining feature of her community.
I don't want people to look at, to see despair and hopelessness in the community of North Tulsa and its residents, because there is the people who live in North Tulsa and other black and brown communities, they are just as hopeful and just as expecting of good life as any other individual. So we, yes, we have our issues and we have things that aren't right amongst our community, but we are people who have hope and expectations for our life to be a good life, just like anybody else.
For Focus Black Oklahoma, I'm Nick Alexandrov in North Tulsa. To learn more about the debate surrounding reparations for Tulsa Race Massacre descendants, tune into the third and final installment of our Battle for Greenwood series on Sunday, November 28th at 3 p.m.
Focus Black Oklahoma has been selected to participate in the Advancing Democracy cohort with the Solutions Journalism Network, or SJN. Our series, In a Confused State, will follow Oklahoma advocacy groups navigating new restrictions on freedoms in 3 areas: reproductive rights, teaching history, and direct action activism. Here, Shalondra Harrison breaks down the anti-protest laws that now significantly impact our communities.
As of November 1st, more than 350 laws went into effect in Oklahoma. According to the Frontier, there were at least 35 pieces of legislation filed by lawmakers in response to the protests that took place last year. These bills included making it a felony to assault, delay, or obstruct a law enforcement officer, including riots in the state's racketeering definition, which is used to prosecute organized crime, requiring permits for protests at the state capitol, creating regulations for demonstrations at the state capitol, making it a crime for people to publish or post anything online that includes personally identifying information about police officers and county officials to threaten, intimidate, harass, or stalk, and a bill that shields drivers from criminal or civil liability if they injure or kill someone while fearful for their life and attempting to flee a riot. The video of George Floyd being killed sparked a racial justice movement in the summer of 2020. According to Time magazine, solidarity protests took place in more than 50 nations. Folks all over the world took to the streets during a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic to make their voices heard about something that happens all too frequently: racial injustice. Black squares were seen across social media platforms as people announced they were listening and learning. In Oklahoma, just as all over the world, young people organized marches and protests. The people most negatively impacted by laws want to be involved in creating expeditious and lasting change. When they feel their voices are being left out of policies and systems, the next step is often to take to the streets. People of all backgrounds attended rallies, marches, and protests across the state of Oklahoma. Oklahoma City-based community organizer and racial justice activist Jess Eddy helped organize protests in both Oklahoma City and Tulsa. A planned Black Lives Matter rally was set to take place on May 31, 2020. However, the day before, a protest took place on Northwest 23rd and Classen in Oklahoma City. He saw that march start off peacefully and then escalate as law enforcement showed up and began arresting people, including himself.
So the next day, we had already planned BLM rally on the east side of Oklahoma City, in the Black community here in Oklahoma City. And I think both because of what was going on nationally, but also what had happened the night before, the attendance at the rally was massive. I think 5,000 to 10,000 people is not an overstatement. And while the rally was very, very centered in the historic movement of a righteous claim for justice and civil rhetoric, people were mad, and people left that rally or came from elsewhere and went downtown again, and basically the same thing repeated.
Not everyone agreed with the method of action taking place. This includes the Oklahoma County District Attorney David Prater. He charged multiple people with crimes such as rioting, incitement to riot, arson, assault and battery on a police officer, and charged 5 young people with terrorism. These charges shocked activists and organizers who felt like the charges were excessive.
When the news came out that the district attorney, David Prater, had filed numerous felony charges against numerous people, and the felony charges were for terrorism, rioting, and assaulting an officer, and all number of really severe, scary felonies. And it was clear at that time that, he was using his prosecutorial discretion to bring, really excessive charges, even if he had grounds to bring them, which I would disagree that he did. He had a variety of charges he could choose from, and he decided to go with the most severe. And that showed me, and I think the whole community here in the city and state, that he was retaliating for the political objectives that the protests were seeking.
Knowing that they were largely from families and communities that didn't have the kinds of financial support to afford those bonds, and that they would sit in jail for months as those cases awaited disposition, Jess and others solicited help from national organizations to assist with bonds.
They were kids. Some of them were under the age of adult. Some of them were just over. They were young and afraid. They were poor. And so we went to work organizing local defense attorneys to represent them pro bono, organizing protests to demand the dropping of those charges, and respond in solidarity with these youth.
One of the men charged with terrorism after the protests in Oklahoma City last May recently chose to plead guilty to arson in the 3rd degree. According to an article by KFOR, his attorney Clay Curtis said, "We did not burn anything. We did not destroy anything. But we did sort of play a role of encouragement." Senator George Young, a state senator from Oklahoma City who is a Democrat, says what he witnessed was peaceful for the most part.
I was downtown in Oklahoma City. By all accounts, the protests were fairly orderly. There were some folk who were saying some things and some water bottles that were thrown. But about my noticing and being involved in the middle of it, I never was afraid or scared, and nobody ever got out of hand to the point that they need to be arrested. Now, they were large crowds, so I can understand that. I can understand them impeding traffic by being as large as they are. But some things, progress has some actions to it that all of us have to suffer through. And I think getting to the point where we allow people to express themselves, particularly when it comes to issues of civil rights and human rights, we need to give room to, because that's really the technical aspects of what our country was based upon, but not the realistic aspects of what our country was based upon.
In May 2020 in Tulsa, a truck pulling a horse trailer drove through a crowd of protesters. Tulsa County District Attorney Steve Kunzweiler declined to file criminal charges against the driver, stating the driver and his family were victims of a violent and unprovoked attack. According to the Oklahoma Highway Patrol, several protesters were hurt during the incident, and one of them fell off the overpass and suffered serious injuries, including paralysis. Though the driver was not charged, lawmakers used this situation as an example of why House Bill 1674 needed to be passed. In the 2021 legislative session, 34 states introduced 81 anti-protest bills. In Oklahoma, one of the bills passed was House Bill 1674. This law shields drivers from criminal or civil liability if they injure or kill someone while fearful for their life and attempting to flee a riot. State statute defines riot as any use of force or violence, or any threat to use force or violence if accompanied by immediate power of execution by 3 or more persons acting together and without authority of law. The new law also classifies obstructing a roadway as a misdemeanor, punishable by up to a year in jail and a fine ranging from $100 to $5,000, as well as liability for damage to person or property. The last section of the law states that organizations found to be conspirators with those who have committed crimes listed in the law will be fined up to $50,000 in penalties for conspiring to obstruct roadways during a riot. In an interview with the New York Times, Republican State Senator from Norman, Rob Standridge, who co-authored House Bill 1674, said the Tulsa incident had prompted him to seek immunity for drivers who strike protesters. He also said he wasn't aware of any drivers who had been charged after striking protesters in Oklahoma. Quote, "My hope is that this new law is never utilized," unquote, he said in an interview. Representative Kevin West from Moore, also a Republican and also a co-author of this bill, had this to say.
When it was said on the House floor, well, this isn't really happening to a whole bunch of people on any one of those, so why are we doing this? Well, that's kind of like saying that, well, I haven't had anyone in my immediate family have been murdered, so is that even really a problem? And we know that it is. When it affects you, then it's a huge deal. Now, hopefully, with the riots bill, my hope is that none of those aspects of it ever need to be used.
Lawmakers on the other side of the aisle have a different take. Senator Young was against this piece of legislation and believed it to be unnecessary.
It was interesting, though. The thing that struck me most was as the bill was presented, it was presented as if there was a problem. It was presented as if there was something that needed to be corrected, that people had acted in such a way that it was dangerous and harmful to the larger population, and which was false, which was just wrong. People were protesting, which they had a constitutional right to do that, to protest, and the knee-jerk response was, we don't like them protesting, particularly against issues that we don't want to hear from them about. That's the best way I can say that. And so it was a knee-jerk response to try their best to harm or to bully or to tell folk, if you're going to take the step of speaking out against issues that we don't want you to speak out against, we're going to make it legally harmful to you to do that.
According to Senator Young, the debate surrounding this bill reminded him of another era.
I was very frustrated, and I was also very discouraged by this type of legislation that was presented on the Senate floor, because it harkened back to days that I'm old enough to remember as a 67-year-old man who was younger than that in Memphis, where I grew up, and saw some of the things that transpired, particularly with law enforcement and those who were responding to protesters during the civil rights movement and Dr. King being in Memphis.
Veto referendums are one tool residents in Oklahoma have to stop laws from going into effect. Over the summer, there was an effort to garner nearly 60,000 signatures across the state in an effort to put the state question on the ballot to allow registered voters to vote on whether or not House Bill 1674 should be a state law. This effort, known as No on State Question 816, was unable to meet the threshold. After the deadline passed and not enough signatures were gathered, it was announced that a lawsuit was filed by the Oklahoma State Conference of the NAACP. The NAACP is represented in this lawsuit by the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown University Law Center. The National NAACP as well as attorney Melvin Hall. The lawsuit argues that the law violates the First and 14th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution and that it was written to discourage peaceful demonstrations in Oklahoma. The president of the Oklahoma State Conference of the NAACP, Anthony Douglas, explains.
The lawsuit that we filed against 1674, we found that lawsuit to be discriminatory on the First and the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution because it was vague, which would subject organizations like the NAACP to criminal penalties for constitutionally protected activities. And so we felt that it was in our best interest that we filed this lawsuit because of that.
A concern that organizations have also expressed is that people will show up to protest with the intention of causing harm.
The way the language of this bill is also indicating is that an individual say, I fear for my life. Where sometimes we know when we're dealing with protests and riots, people shows up, and then you have someone has nothing to do with it, drive down to the middle of it, and then they claim, I fear for my life. The question becomes, why did you drive down there in the first place if you knew there was a rally protest? So that would make this bill dangerous. That is what we're fighting against it. And that's why the NAACP has taken the leadership role to make sure that we're not going to stand by and allow a bill like this just to be implemented into law.
Laws like this one have people turning to organizations such as the American Civil Liberties Union to figure out how to stop the law. One of the ACLU's focus areas is direct action. Tamaya Cox-Teray is the executive director for the ACLU of Oklahoma. She says in regards to this particular bill, they are supporting the efforts of the Oklahoma NAACP.
We will file an amicus brief, which is a friend of the court brief, supporting their efforts. We knew because of the capacity and some of the other litigation that we were looking forward to do, that we just did not have the capacity to take this case on, but we had been in talks with NAACP prior to them filing this lawsuit. So we had time. We knew that we could support them in different efforts. But one of the things, the best thing that I think that the ACLU doing is really doing an education series where we are talking to those that will be directly impacted if this law were to go into a place, so specifically protesters and those that have been protesting for a long time, and really encouraging them to understand how the law should be applied or how it will go into effect. And if by any means anything goes different or they're being harassed or being arrested, that the ACLU will be there to make sure that we can take on their case if need be.
In the same spirit of people feeling like they aren't being heard, Tamaya talks about the disconnect between the elected officials and those in the community fighting for change.
I think it showed a complete disconnect, which tends to happen at the Oklahoma legislature and with the people. Oklahoma legislature was talking, well, this is simply a way to protect Oklahomans. We need to protect drivers that get in a situation where mobs, right, and rioters are involved. And just the language that legislators were using for protesters. People that were simply protesting against police brutality, the way that they were weaponized under the dome during the presentation of these bills was a new thing to me as someone who's been lobbying for 15 years. And then what we were hearing, in the community and what we truly believed was that this was an attack on First Amendment rights, and this was an attack on protesters. At a time where we were seeing protests across the nation, we should be finding ways to protect and ensuring that protesters are safe during demonstrations, where the Oklahoma legislature went completely opposite and found ways to criminalize protesting. For the longest, I have this quote that I've said is that when policy is created without people considered, that's where oppression lives. And that's what it is. It's that people are not considered and not centered in this legislation. Because if they were, then they would have said, let's hold up, let's back up and say, okay, how can this truly impact protesters? How can this truly impact Oklahomans? And what is what are the consequences, but what are the benefits? There's no benefit from creating a law like 1674 because, again, district attorneys already have the right and already have the privilege of charging motorists or not charging motorists in those situations. So there's already policy in place to counteract what the hope of the legislator for 1674 was. So the blind spots, again, and I recognize I come from a very progressive background, so the legislation that I continue to see never centers people and only centers politicians and politics. And it is people that will have the negative impact, and it's people that will be severely and disparately impacted by the legislation time and time again.
Senator Young also advocates for legislation to have a community impact statement. He has introduced legislation in the last 4 sessions to include a racial or community impact statement for every piece of legislation that creates a new sentence, makes a longer sentence, or creates reasons to put folks in jail. House Bill 1674 is a bill that he says would have benefited from having one.
We talked about the House bill that looked at putting protesters in jail. And the other terminology in 1674, the protest bill, was the terminology used about those folk were not protesters, they were rioters. And so that gives the judicial system another way of coming at those folks. So you got that, which makes the community impact statements and racial impact statements even more significant, because obviously that bill had in it a direct correlation to what the community and racial impact statements was trying to prevent, and it is pinpointing a certain group of folk, particularly young, people of color, Hispanic, Black, all of that was part of that bill. That's exactly who they can say it's not, but that's exactly who that bill was going for. Again, I did say young people, because there was a lot of young white people, and I think the bill was for that too. They were just trying to get anybody net they could, but it was a bill that probably would have been very helpful in looking at who would be impacted by 1674, what group and what community. And if a community or racial impact statement had been done on it, I can guarantee you it would have been a high number of individuals who were people of color and who were young.
On Wednesday, October 27, 2021, U.S. District Judge Robin Cothran granted a preliminary injunction to prevent 2 parts of House Bill 1674 from taking effect on November 1st. The judge put on hold the provision that makes it a misdemeanor for people to unlawfully obstruct a public street or highway, which could be punishable with up to a year in jail and a $5,000 fine. The judge did the same for the provision that could result in fines up to $50,000 for groups or organizations found to be a conspirator with someone who violates any number of state laws pertaining to riots and unlawful assemblies. However, the judge did not block the section of the law that gives immunity to drivers who hit someone while trying to escape a dangerous riot. Organizations want you to be informed on what to do in case you have any issues while attending a rally, protest, or march in Oklahoma. Here's Anthony Douglas again.
If you run into any situation during your protest, march, or rally, first of all, look out for your own safety and welfare of you and your family and the people that surround with you. Contact the NAACP. You can contact our state office, our local office, or you can call the police. And make sure you file an official police report at that moment of what happened.
For Focus, Black Oklahoma, I'm Shalondra Harrison in Oklahoma City.
Crystal Patrick brings us the story about how advocacy for Black soldiers whose service to our country has gone unrecognized became a family affair for the late Colonel Major Mark and his daughter, Dr. Vivian Clark Adams.
On January 13, 1997, President Bill Clinton awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 Black World War II veterans in a ceremony in Washington, D.C. The journey started when one Tulsa man, Lieutenant Colonel Major Clark, spent much of his retirement from the military advocating for the recognition of Black soldiers whose exemplary service had been previously overlooked and outright denied by the United States military and government. Dr. Vivian Clark Adams is the daughter of Lieutenant Colonel Major Clark. Clark began writing a book about his life, but passed away before he was done. Just like her father, Dr. Clark Adams is passionate about these stories being told and has decided to complete his book. Clark was born in Headland, Alabama in 1914. His family faced financial hardship and had to sell their farm. After hearing about Oklahoma being the land of opportunity, the Clark family packed up and moved to Taft, an all-Black town at the time. The family eventually moved to Haskell, Oklahoma. Clark enrolled at Booker T. Washington High School. He loved school and was an enthusiastic student so much so that he graduated early and with honors. After graduation and unable to find work, Clark and his father, Marcus Clark, traveled across state lines to provide for the family. Unfortunately, Clark's father passed away while traveling, and he returned home as the sole provider. Clark began working odd jobs, one being right across the street from the armory, and the military exercises he observed being conducted inspired him to enlist. He was assigned to the 349th Field Artillery Unit in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Clark, along with many other black men, joined the United States military eager to prove their patriotism. They were hopeful their service would override the racism and unjust laws in America. The soldiers quickly learned racism was as deeply embedded in the American military as much as it was embedded in American laws.
Dad was blessed to be in one of the only two field artillery units, black artillery units, that was commanded all the way through by a black officer. Because the practice was when they had a black unit was to either demote the black officers, or if they didn't demote them, they would promote white officers over them.
Mm-hmm. One of her father's inspirations was Colonel Wendell Derricks. Colonel Derricks served in the military as an officer of an all-black unit. Because of the racism that was rampant in the military at that time, race was the determining factor for assignments and rewards. Observing firsthand the racism he and his fellow black soldiers faced, Colonel Derricks looked ahead to the future of blacks not only in the military, but also in other leadership positions in other professions.
Derricks was such a powerful leader. He was not, some of the black troop members thought he wasn't well educated enough because he didn't have I don't think he had a college degree where some of the others did, but he was a very bright and astute man. And one thing he realized was that, first of all, he had to provide a buffer for his troops. Mm-hmm. That's part of this bridgehead where there was so much, racism that he filtered out so that it didn't affect his troops as much as, say, those troops that had white officers.
Many of the men who served alongside Clark under Colonel Derricks ultimately ended up working in a variety of distinguished professions.
And his whole goal was to make sure his men were well trained to fit into those new opportunities. That's one reason my dad was able to go to the Pentagon. He worked at the Pentagon for 4 years.
Although Clark enjoyed his life in the military, he cut it short about 10 years before retirement because his family was growing.
Dad retired in 1960. I really think he would have gone further. He retired as a lieutenant colonel, but my poor mom had packed up us 2 kids, and by the time we got, when he retired, when we moved back to Oklahoma, a 3rd kid was on the way.
Clark and other like-minded veterans from his unit began researching heroic acts of blacks on the battlefield, making a case for them to be recognized even decades later.
The Army was always his love. So what he decided to do after that, I think his first project was with the Department of Defense. He had been the troop historian for his 597th Field Artillery, and he knew, what happened while they were in war. He kept a diary. He has his commanding officer's diary, he had Derrick's diary, and another one of the officers. So they kept an account of what happened.
When the anniversaries of military conflicts were being observed in the nation, Clark began noticing major omissions.
They got together and demanded that the Department of Defense change the distortions and accurately portray what was going on and stop the omissions, too. I mean, they would omit whole units when they'd have the anniversary edition or whatever it was. They would omit some of the black units that were definitely part of that, spectrum that was, involved in whatever battle. They successfully made some changes in the Department of Defense documents in terms of how they presented black fighting men.
While conducting his research, Clark came across an Oklahoma connection.
One of the major things that was involved in, though, was the Medal of Honor recipients. You know that in World War II, there were no black Medal of Honor recipients.
In 1997, the hard work paid off. President Clinton awarded 7 Medals of Honor to black military veterans from World War II who displayed heroic acts of service. Only one recipient was still living at the time. Although Lieutenant Colonel Major Clark received an invitation from the White House to attend, he decided to watch the ceremony from home.
One individual who fit the criteria was Reuben Rivers, an Oklahoman. So he started working with, the Rivers family, but he and some other of his cohorts, they got together and they made all kinds of noise and provided all kinds of documentation to show that there were so many, Black individuals who were just as courageous as any of the other white Medal of Honor winners.
The passion of Clark and others like him to bring the prestigious service of Black World War II veterans to light, in spite of the racism under which it was buried, is a part of American history from which all Americans benefit. Clark was determined that the soldiers who served their country with honor no longer be denied their overdue recognition because of racism. For Focus, Black Oklahoma, I'm Crystal Patrick in Tulsa.
Many indigenous languages are in danger of disappearing. Colonization, assimilation, and the COVID-19 pandemic have taken their toll on many, including the elders of the Creek Nation. Yet despite all the loss, Native language lives on through the culture keepers. Britny Cordera has the story.
COVID-19 has greatly affected the preservation of Native languages. According to a video titled For the Love of Our People by Kyle Bell, in 2020, Muskoka churches in the Creek Nation were shut down, and many fluent speakers who were elders who spoke the language daily died from COVID complications. Despite the pandemic, despite historical trauma, these endangered languages will persevere as long as Native people exist.
O mesko metapia kasis, hiskat chimo chagis, mo mesko metapia kasis.
Joe Kuhn sings, "Keep Striving, We Will Go," a Muskoka hymn of encouragement. This is the hymn he sang to his brother while attending him on his deathbed in 1999.
Itkat chimo chagis, miko sapalgia piana. Itkat chimo chagis, miko sapalgia piana.
One of the things that really got me kind of started was my brother was dying. It was a year after my mother had passed away. And when we went to visit him, he was on his deathbed, and he asked us to sing some of the Native hymns. We all went to church, but most of the time we didn't go into the church. I thought he never did, but apparently he had, and he wanted to hear those songs.
It was this moment that inspired Mr. Kuhn to learn Muskoka hymns, minister them to his elders who were moving on from this world into the next, and teach hymns to his community and on Facebook. He felt bad that he could only recite 2 hymns for his brother.
I was ashamed. I knew about 2 songs that were real popular among our people, and I knew those 2 songs, so we sang those 2 songs for him, and that's all we could sing, And on the way home, I made a vow that I wouldn't let that happen again. If somebody wanted to hear the songs, that I would know the songs and that I would sing them for them. And so I would go to places where they would sing. And so I learned everything from being in the church and singing with the groups.
Joe Kuhn is an educator, certified language instructor for the Oklahoma Department of Education, and was the director of the Seminole Nation Language Department. Even though he grew up speaking and learning Muskoka up until 1st grade, he spent 41 years not speaking his native tongue.
I was raised in a family where both of my parents spoke the native Muskogee language. That's all they spoke. I've been working with language for a long time. I did a lot of volunteer teaching in Oklahoma City, and I went to Tulsa and taught up there. And so, and I did a lot on Facebook. I opened up my own page. Mostly I taught the native hymns.
He stopped learning his language at a young age, when his father thought there was no opportunity for his children's future learning Muskoka. And at the age of 15, Mr. Kuhn went off to boarding school.
And so I grew up hearing it until probably about 1st grade. He determined that we were going to get left behind, and one of the things he said was, if you don't learn to speak English good, you're not going to get the good jobs that's out there. They'll be giving them to the other kids who know how to speak English. So in 1967, I went off to boarding school, and I never really spoke the language again for, I guess, till about 2008.
Settler colonialism is the reason why some people lost their language. According to an article written by Kelsey Klug in Cultural Survival, Native Americans lost control of the education of their children when the United States government forcibly enrolled them in residential schools. Children were severely punished for using their language instead of English. These experiences, paired with a rising capitalist economy that favored English speakers, convinced entire generations of Native people that their children would be better off learning English only. Mr. Kuhn got back into relearning Muskoke and overcame obstacles in speaking his native language when his mother came to him in a dream after she passed away, the year before his brother died.
I kind of stagnated when I first began to learn, and I thought, well, I know the words, but I can't speak them in sentences. And I was about to give up. And one night I had a dream. In this dream, my mother was sitting next to me, and there was about 12 to 15 other women sitting in a circle. We were sitting on logs, and they began to speak to me, and I began to respond to them. They would ask me questions, and I would answer them in my native language. And I thought, when I woke up, I thought, wow, I got it up there. I just got to get it out. And so it kind of put me on to the next plateau to study. And so right now I'm about 85% fluent.
Hope Craig Corlew is Muskoke Creek, descendant of freedmen, a mother and student of Muskoke language. She is from California and lives there with her husband and children. Her family is from Lena, Oklahoma, which she considers home and visits often.
I will say this in our language. Ishte Muskoge Muskogolgi Does. I am of the Muskogee people. And the reason why it's important to say I am of the Muskogee people, or Ishte Muskogolgi Does, is because I can trace my ancestry back for many generations. So I am here because of those who stood before me. My mother is Muskogee. Both her parents are Muskogee. My father is Black.
Facebook and online groups are the future of accessibility for native language learners. In fact, that's where she met Joe Kuhn.
I met Mr. Kuhn over Facebook. I want to say it was either through another citizens Muskogee language page, but Mr. Kuhn has always been involved in teaching our language and trying to find different ways or techniques, tools to help teach our language to Muskogee people or Muskogee, whether you live on the reservation or outside. And one of the challenges that we have for those like myself who is not immersed in our culture or back home, as I say, do I sound right? Mr. Kuhn has been that person to say, don't worry about what you sound like, just keep practicing because then you're going to be confident speaking the language.
As long as Native people exist, Native languages will speak. If you want to learn Muskoke, consider joining Joe Kuhn's Facebook group and signing up for online lessons through the Muskoke Language Learning Program Instagram page. For Focus Black Oklahoma, I'm Britny Cordera in Seminole Nation.
Focus Black Oklahoma is produced in partnership with KOSU Radio, Tulsa Artist Fellowship, and Tri-City Collective. Additional support is provided by the George Kaiser Family Foundation and the Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Philanthropies. Our theme music is by Moffett Music. Focus Black Oklahoma's executive producers are Kuresh Ali Lansanon and Bracken Clark. Our associate producers are Nick Alexandrov and Vanessa Gaona. Our production intern is Smriti Iyengar. Visit us online at kosu.org, tricitycollective.com/Focus Black Oklahoma, and YouTube at Tri-City Collective. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Focus Black OK. You can hear Focus Black Oklahoma on demand for free at kosu.org, NPR One, npr.org, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Have you ever wanted to walk in the shoes of someone else, someone who thinks differently than you, to understand their perspective? KOSU invites you to take a concrete step towards healing the political divide through StoryCorps' One Small Step project. When you sign up, you'll get the chance to have a personal 50-minute conversation with someone new about your lives. So ditch the debate and learn the lived experience behind someone else's perspective. Sign up today at kosu.org/onesmallstep.